Hey friends, Jill here. Welcome back to Whispering Willow Farm. I'm in my tunnel this morning because I've got a chore list that keeps growing. So I have got my winter squashes in here, and actually this was kind of an accident. I thought that I grew these little bushy squash varieties in the tunnel, and it was just kind of some extras that I had, and it turns out they were these vining acorn squash and spaghetti squashes. So I've kind of got these squashes just coming all the way down, but today I'm going to harvest them because they have a really nasty disease called powdery mildew, which is very, very common when it comes to squash plants. I'm actually going to take the camera off and show you guys. And when you catch this, you need to immediately address it. And so the reason these got powdery mildew is because I've been keeping the sides of the tunnel down. One, because it's been cold and I still have fall tomatoes in here, and I've got fall cucumbers, and so I'm trying to trap as much heat in here as I can so that those tomatoes will continue to ripen and the cucumbers will keep putting on fruit, because these are typically things that you're growing in the summertime, not when it's cold. Well, because I did that and there wasn't good airflow, that's when all that powdery mildew started to happen. This is on, you know, the bed that's closest to the sidewall, and so that heat, and it just gets sticky and gross. And so really when you start to notice powdery mildew, you want to rip those plants up. Never put it in your compost. It'll just spread that disease. So what I do is I rip it out and I immediately burn it. So I burn all of those plants. So I've already got a burn pile ready outside of the high tunnel, but I thought first, let's harvest these squash. Let's see what we got. And then some of these aren't actually ripe yet. So I'm going to kind of talk to you guys about what I plan on doing there. Alright, so this is powdery mildew, and you guys can see here it literally looks like powder is on there, and what happens is it just begins to spread like wildfire. So I mean, it's just covered everything. Obviously it starts to really damage the structure of your plants. You'll see that they're wilty, they've got all this other discoloration. They don't look well, right? These all look horrible. So that's when I know, okay, Jill, you got to get these plants out of here pretty quickly. So we're going to go through, we're going to find all the little squash plants in here, harvest them, and then we're going to actually flip this bed and get it ready. But this is a sign of powdery mildew. If you see it, immediately address it. Alright, so what you need to harvest squash? Your coffee. You need your coffee and you need some pruners. And so really kind of simple. I am going to get a bucket real quick. I'm going to grab this bucket. I prefer when I am harvesting most things. I would say peppers are one of those things that like I'll just totally like toss and pile up in a basket. But for tomatoes, for cucumbers, for squashes, things like that, I like to, I have got a bunch of these like black crates, and a lot of these are food grade crates, and I like to lay them in single layers. Don't ever stack on top of them, especially with your soft vegetables or fruits, I guess, like tomatoes. They can get punctured really easily. Cucumbers can get cracked. When I'm going inside, I'm going to be moving all of these squash in single layers is how I'm going to store them. So I just prefer to go ahead and do that here. So I've got my little basket here. I'll strap on in a second, and we'll just lay some of these in here. So, all right. Bucket, check. Pruners, check. Coffee, check. Alright, so let's weed through the grass here. This is another reason why I really want to get this squash out of here, because I need to flip this bed and get it ready to plant something in. And so I kind of laid like clear plastic down thinking it would help with the weeds, and it didn't. This one space right here, and only this bed, I deal with grass really bad. I don't really know what the deal is. I've done all the things I know to do, but I am going to flip this bed and try to plant a cover crop to kind of help with some of that. So I got to really get this squash out and get a game plan for this bed. But when you're dealing with disease plants, you could use like gloves or something like that if you're not wanting to. But if you are going to move from like the plant that you're working with that's diseased to a plant that's not diseased, go wash your hands. I left my gloves literally on the table. I got them out. Totally forgot about them. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to, you know, harvest all of these squashes. Then I'm going to go through and rip all these plants out, and then I'm going to go wash my hands, and I'll come back down here. So that's just something to note. So let's harvest some of this acorn squash and talk about how to know if it's ready. So this is my first year growing winter squash, believe it or not. Let me move over here. It's a little, there we go. All right, so here we have our little acorn squash. So this was my first year growing winter squashes. And why I've never grown winter squashes in the past, I'm not sure. We don't grow a ton of squash as is because we deal with a lot of squash bugs and pests, and we have found that we'll just support that farmer down at the farmer's market instead of like attracting all those pests not to really have a very worthy harvest. And so I thought, you know what, let's try to grow winter squashes and see. And then this squash is, I believe, a Tuffy variety is what it's called. And it is supposed to resemble a sweet potato. And so I'm thinking through, you know, how I'm gonna cook this and what I'm gonna do. And so I'm thinking about making some purees. I'm thinking about roasting them. I thought about making, you know, some sort of like acorn pancakes and do like a spin on a breakfast. So I think it'll be pretty versatile, but these are good little size squashes. Now, since I have never grown an acorn squash or winter squash for that matter, you know, I didn't really know the protocols, I guess, when it came to harvesting and storing and things of that nature. And so what did I do? I got out all my books. I went to the internet and there's a lot of really good information out there on when to harvest. And so what I read said that obviously when you're, you know, your squash has turned dark and it's dull, when it's hard and it's no longer soft. So these have been ripe for a couple weeks, and it did say that if you're wanting to store your winter squash, once it's ripened, let it stay on the vine a week or two later. And so I've come through, all my winter squashes have been ready for about 2 weeks now, but I let them stay on the vine just to have longevity for storage. That's what I've read. So you can see here, I mean, all of it's good and dark green. I left a little bit of stem length when I cut because I read that that would kind of help with moisture issues for storing, that you don't want to cut it super low. And then none of it is soft to the touch. So this is super, super hard. You can literally knock all around it. So a couple things that I was reading were just saying, make sure that you know, your color's fully developed, make sure that there's no soft spots, that it's all hard. And look at there, that looks pretty good to me. So here's one. Put it over here in my bucket. Let's harvest some more. Man, these caterpillars, y'all, they're eating my squash. So good thing I came out here when I did. Oh yeah, that's awesome. So some of these too that are just fully ripened, I didn't even have to cut. When I went and just grabbed the squash off, it just broke right off. So that's a good sign that it's ripe and it's good and it's ready to harvest. All right, y'all, so while my acorn squash is good and ready, should have been harvested a hot minute ago, I've got these spaghetti squashes, and as you can see, the spaghetti squash doesn't quite look like a spaghetti squash, and so these aren't ripe, but I have got to get this plant out of, you know, the tunnel. I'm so fearful that it's just going to spread this disease, and I really can't have that. And so when it comes to winter squashes, you do want to harvest them all before the first frost. Now, we had a light frost a couple weeks ago, and it did a little bit of damage, but my plants are still thriving that are outside. And so I'm just going to keep waiting and I've got some spaghetti squash out there. I'm going to let it continue to fully ripen. I have some bigger butternut squashes that I'm going to let ripen. But these in here, you know, what do I do? And I've read a lot of conflicting information. You know, some people say absolutely yes, your spaghetti squash will ripen off the vine. Some, you know, articles that I read said no, they'll end up rotting. But kind of what I gathered, the information I gathered was if your plant, your spaghetti squash, has already started to turn color, so it's moving from green to that orange yellowish, which you guys can see here, we're trying to get there, then it will in fact ripen off the vine. It did still say to cut a good amount of stem with it, and so really this is just going to be kind of a trial, and I'm going to see. So I've got those big racks, those metal racks, we buy them at like the hardware store. I have one of those down in my basement, and so I'm just gonna lay newspaper and lay all these out. It does say to store squash, you want to keep it you know, I think between like 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit is what they said. It doesn't like it too cold, it doesn't like it too hot. So I figured my basement is cool, it's dark, I can just kind of stick these down there to cure, and so I'm hoping that these will continue to ripen. I'll definitely check back with you guys. The thing is I probably have around 8 to 10 of these spaghetti squashes in the tunnel, but I have at least, I planted out 15 plants outside. So I know that if these don't ripen, that'll be unfortunate, but I can feed them to the pigs, and I know that I still will have, you know, spaghetti squash outside that I can harvest. So this is kind of an experiment this year. I grew this, you know, Tuffy acorn squash, which is the only acorn squash variety that I grew, but I grew 3 different butternut squashes. I grew a honey nut variety, I grew a little personal size, which is this small little, you know, butternut, and then I grew your traditional large one. And so I'm kind of taking notes on which one of these flavors that I prefer the most, which was the most fun to cook with, and kind of do an assessment. And then same with these, you know, spaghetti squashes. I didn't really need a ton of these. We're not cooking with spaghetti squash a ton, but I think with the other squash varieties, they're super versatile in what we can do. So yay, I harvested my first squashes, y'all. I'm so excited. I love growing new varieties. I've been growing food for over a decade, which seems crazy. And it's so fun. It's still so fun. So if ever you get in this place where you're just kind of stagnant on like, ugh, I gotta grow more food, and it becomes this chore and this thing that you don't enjoy, grow something you've never grown before. Grow something that's going to require you to sit down and dig in and research and learn something new. Grow something that's going to excite you to take into the kitchen and try a new way of cooking it. I personally never cooked acorn squash. We cook a lot of butternuts, and so I'm excited to play around with the new things, the new recipes I can craft in the kitchen, figuring out how to store it. Like right now, we're really kind of drawn to those things that will store for a long time and we can just grab from our pantry. You know, I know I just ordered onions, and that was something that I am growing different onion varieties than I ever have before, mainly for storage. I'm growing a lot of shallots because they store, you know, 7, 8, 9, 12 months versus an onion. The longest storage onion I could find was a 6-month storage option, you know, and so play around with that. Make sure you know what your goals are. Make sure you know what your driving factor is. But if you ever get stagnant, you ever get tired of doing the same thing over and over again, you guys, you got to spice it up a little. You got to spice it up, find something new to grow. It's what I do, and it's worked out for me so far. All right, enough chit chat, and I got to get back to work. Nathan's gonna come home today and be like, what did you get done? I told him I had a long list of things, and so far I haven't gotten a lot of that done on the list, but this is one thing that's for sure getting done. So let's finish harvesting these spaghetti squashes. Alright guys, that was a pretty decent haul. I'm going to go through and weigh them all, and I'm going to put on my little clipboard how many plants I had, how much fruit I got off of it, and I'll continue to do this with all the winter squash growing beside the high tunnel as well. But if you guys have storage tips, or you know more information than I do when it comes to those spaghetti squashes that aren't quite ripened yet, please leave it down below. This is honestly one of the things I love about this lifestyle is I've been growing food for a decade, you guys, a stinking decade. That's a long time. But when there are still varieties I've never grown, there are still things that I'm learning, and I'm, you know, growing in so many different ways, just like many of you guys are, which is why it's important to have this community where we can, you know, share the things that we know well, the tips, the techniques, our favorite varieties, but then also we can learn from you guys as well. I feel like as long as we stay in a place where we're willing to be taught, that's a really good place to be. And that's a season I want to always live in. I want to always be learning and growing as a gardener, you know, as a wife, as a mother, as a friend. Like, that list goes on and on and on. And how we do that is by extending that invitation of like, hey, I'm willing to teach you all the cool, wonderful things I've learned over the last 10 years from the garden, but I also want to be taught by you guys. What are your tips? What are your tricks? What are the varieties you love? Because I feel like when we share information like that, that's when we're all really growing as people and as gardeners, and that's a sweet space to be in. But thanks for hanging out with me today. As you can see, I've shucked my flannel. I'm about to go grab those work gloves and really get down to the nitty-gritty and get busy, but thanks for hanging out with me. I'll talk to you soon.